The afternoon of August 20, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. A dirt strip carved from jungle, hacked from coconut groves, still reeking of Japanese construction oil and tropical mud, baking under the South Pacific sun. For 13 days, American Marines had held this island by their fingernails. Japanese bombers came every afternoon like clockwork. Japanese warships shelled them at night. The jungle beyond the perimeter was thick with enemy soldiers, waiting for the order to retake what the Americans had stolen. And at the center of it all, the single most important piece of real estate in the entire Pacific War, a half-finished runway no wider than a country road and not much smoother than one. Then they heard it, a low hum from the southeast. Every Marine on that runway stopped working and looked up. 31 aircraft appeared out of the afternoon haze. 19 Grumman Wildcat fighters and 12 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, dropping out of the sky toward that battered strip of earth. They circled once and came into land. One after another their wheels touched the mud and coral, bouncing hard on the uneven surface, rolling past craters that had been filled that same morning by men with shovels, and in some cases by men using their steel helmets as shovels because there were not enough tools to go around. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, stood at the edge of the strip and watched the first Dauntless taxi to a stop. He later recorded the moment in his memoir with 4 words: "Thank God you have come." That sentence tells you everything about what those 13 days had been like. It tells you what was at stake, and it raises a question the history books tend to skip past. Who built the thing those aircraft just landed on, and what did it take to keep it standing? Henderson Field was not much to look at in August of 1942. At the moment those first aircraft arrived, it measured roughly 3,800 feet in length and 150 feet in width. The surface was a mixture of graded volcanic earth, crushed coral, and dried mud that turned to soup whenever it rained, which in the Solomon Islands was frequently and without warning. The drainage was almost non-existent. The crown, the slight rise in the center of a runway that sheds water to either side, had not been properly graded. There were no hardstands, no real taxiways, and no repair facilities beyond what could be improvised from salvaged Japanese lumber and whatever was at hand. The airfield had been started by Japanese naval construction troops and Korean conscript laborers in early July of 1942. Roughly 2,500 men in total had pushed a strip through the coconut plantation at Lunga Point on the northern coast of Guadalcanal. They had brought 2 400-kilowatt diesel generators, 15 trucks, 8 tandem rollers, a narrow-gauge rail system for moving soil, and a full complement of construction machinery. An airfield here would give Japanese aircraft a forward base deep in the Solomons, within striking range of Allied sea lanes and threatening the entire Allied position in the South Pacific. By the night of August 6, they had finished roughly 2,600 feet and were celebrating with sake rations, confident the job would be complete within days. They never finished it. The next morning, the United States Marines came ashore. The field was named within days for Major Lofton Henderson of Marine Air Group 22, a 39-year-old aviator from Lorain, Ohio, who had led his Vought Vindicator dive bombers in a glide-bombing attack on the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway on June 4, 1942, without fighter escort, knowing the odds against him, and had not come back. He was the first Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. It was a fitting name for a runway that would ask the same question of every man who served on it: how much are you willing to give? The men sent to finish what the Japanese had started were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were construction workers in uniform: ironworkers, carpenters, electricians, pipe fitters, heavy equipment operators, men who had spent their civilian careers building roads, bridges, dams, and buildings across the continental United States. They were the naval construction battalions. The Pacific War knew them simply as the Seabees. The Seabees had not existed 2 years earlier. They were born from a legal problem that had already cost American lives. Before the war, the Navy had relied on civilian contractors to build its bases across the Pacific. When the Japanese struck Wake Island in December of 1941, the roughly 1,200 civilian workers there found themselves in an impossible position. Under the laws of war, armed civilians were classified as guerrillas and could be executed on the spot. They could fight and risk being shot as unlawful combatants, or they could surrender and become prisoners. Many did both and died either way. The lesson was written in blood on a tiny island most Americans had never heard of before December of 1941. Rear Admiral Ben Moreell, chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, understood exactly what that lesson meant for every civilian worker across the Pacific theater. On December 28, 1941, just 21 days after Pearl Harbor, Moreell submitted a formal request for authority to militarize the Navy's construction workforce. The Bureau of Navigation authorized the concept on January 5, 1942. The first battalions were formally established on March 5, 1942, the date the Seabees celebrate as their founding. The recruits came from every corner of American industry: a union carpenter from Chicago, a heavy equipment operator from a Louisiana oil field, a bridge rigger from the steel towns of western Pennsylvania, a pipe fitter who had worked the refineries along the Texas Gulf Coast. The Navy went out specifically to find them, placing recruiters at union halls and construction companies and sending word through the skilled trades. The message was simple: bring your tools, learn to fight, go where the Navy needs a base built. The response was remarkable. Men who had been told for years that they were too old for military service showed up in numbers that surprised the recruiting offices. They wanted to be useful. They had things to offer that no amount of training could replicate in a 19-year-old. And they understood, in a way that only men who have built things understand, that what they were being asked to do was possible, however hard it looked. The men recruited into those first battalions were unlike any other military force in American history. The average age of the early Seabee enlistee was 37 years old. Many were in their 40s. Some were older, men who had laid rail across the Nevada desert, driven pilings in the Gulf of Mexico, built tunnels under Manhattan, poured concrete for Grand Coulee Dam, spent careers on construction sites where the work was hard and the schedule never moved for weather. They were recruited specifically for their civilian trade skills and paid accordingly, making them the highest-paid enlisted men in the United States military. Marine Corps drill instructors handled their combat training, and those instructors made a certain adjustment for men who were considerably older, considerably more experienced in life, and considerably less impressed by shouting than the average 19-year-old recruit. Their motto, written by Moreell himself in Latin, was Construimus, Batuimus, we build, we fight. Their informal motto was Can Do. The Seabee insignia, a furious bumblebee in a Navy hat clutching a Tommy gun, a wrench, and a hammer simultaneously, was sketched by a civilian file clerk named Frank Iafrati at Naval Air Station Quonset Point in early 1942. It became one of the most recognized symbols in the entire war. Unlike the standard recruit who arrived with no relevant skills, the Seabee arrived already knowing his trade at a professional level. A crane operator had been running cranes for 15 years. A structural steel worker had spent his career assembling bridges under real-world pressure. What the Marine instructors added was the combat overlay: how to work with one eye on the sky, how to build a perimeter while you built a runway, and how to fight with whatever tools were at hand when the weapons ran out. Seabee training ran through Camp Allen and Camp Bradford in Virginia, Camp Peary near Williamsburg, and the main training depot at Davisville, Rhode Island, known as Camp Endicott, and called informally the home of the Seabees. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had reached its first great turning point. The Battle of Midway in June had cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and the majority of its trained carrier aviators in a single catastrophic engagement. The Japanese Navy had not been broken, but its ability to project offensive power had been severely damaged. On the ground, in the air, and on the water, the Japanese were still a formidable enemy who had yet to lose a land campaign to American forces. The American strategic problem in the Pacific was fundamentally a problem of range. Aircraft of that era had limited reach. To advance across thousands of miles of open ocean against an enemy who already controlled the islands, the United States needed forward airfields. Not someday. Now. Close enough to support the next amphibious landing, close enough to put fighters over the invasion fleet, close enough to strike enemy bases before they could reinforce their positions. The distance between an airfield and the next objective determined how fast the war could move, and the Japanese understood this as well as the Americans did. The man who controlled the air above the next piece of ground controlled what happened on it. This was not an abstract strategic principle. It translated into a very specific physical equation. A fighter aircraft operating from a base 600 miles away cannot provide useful air cover over a landing beach. A dive bomber flying that same distance arrives with barely enough fuel to make a single attack run before turning back. But a fighter operating from an airfield 50 miles away can loiter for hours, intercept incoming raids before they reach the ships, and land, rearm, and go back up in the same afternoon. The airfield was not a supporting element of the Pacific campaign. It was the campaign. Every decision about which island to take next, every calculation about what was achievable and what was not, flowed from the question of where the next airfield would be and how fast it could be made to work. Guadalcanal was the answer to that problem, but only if the airfield could be taken, finished, and held. The island sat at the southeastern tip of the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 900 miles from Rabaul, the great Japanese base complex on New Britain that was the nerve center of the entire South Pacific campaign. A working airfield at Guadalcanal could put American aircraft within range of Rabaul, protect the supply lines running to Australia, and form the anchor of an advance the Americans intended to push north, island by island, until Japan itself was within reach. Every ship sunk, every aircraft destroyed, and every man who died in the 6 months of fighting on and around Guadalcanal was paid in service of that single purpose, keeping one runway open. The Japanese High Command understood the same thing. The moment they realized the Americans had taken the field in a single morning, they committed to retaking it with an urgency that drove every decision for the next 6 months. They ran destroyer convoys down the slot at night, what the Marines called the Tokyo Express, carrying troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. They sent airstrikes from Rabaul nearly every day. They sent the combined fleet to bombard the perimeter from the sea. They committed some of their best infantry, men who had fought in China and Malaya and the Philippines, and had not been stopped yet. All of it was aimed at one objective: putting out the lights on Henderson Field. The morning of August 7th, 1942, began in a way the Marines of the 1st Division would never entirely forget. After months of training in Wellington, New Zealand, after weeks at sea packed into transports running without lights, they stood at the rails as dawn revealed a tropical island of extraordinary beauty. Forested mountains rose steeply from a narrow coastal plain. The sea was calm. Parrots moved through the palm canopy above beaches that looked, to men from Kansas and Kentucky and Ohio, like something from a travel magazine. The Japanese were not expecting them. The landings on August 7 went across the beaches against almost no resistance. C Company, 1st Marines, under 1st Lieutenant Nikolai Stevenson, along with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, reached the airfield at 4 in the afternoon of August 8. The Japanese construction troops had fled into the jungle so quickly they had left breakfast cooking on their fires, bags of rice, tools laid out on work tables, personal letters and photographs scattered across living quarters, sake bottles still half full, abandoned in the moment between understanding the Americans had landed and running for the tree line. The inventory of what had been captured was encouraging: 2 400-kilowatt diesel generators, still operational, 15 trucks, 8 tandem rollers, a narrow-gauge rail system, bags of cement, and 2 sections of runway with a gap of roughly 200 feet in the center where grading had not been completed. What the inventory could not capture was what was missing. The transports carrying most of the division's heavy engineering equipment were still offshore when Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa brought a cruiser force down the slot on the night of August 8 and sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in one of the worst naval defeats in American history. The surviving transports fled south. Only roughly 15% of the 1st Marine Division's heavy engineering equipment had made it to shore before they left. The Marines held a partially complete airfield, a jungle island, a shrinking perimeter, and almost none of the tools they needed. Beyond the perimeter, in the darkness of the jungle, the Japanese were already gathering to take it back. The 1st Engineer Battalion and the 1st Pioneer Battalion of the 1st Marine Division went to work on August 9 with what they had: Japanese rollers, Japanese rail cars, Japanese trucks, American shovels. American hands. Closing the gap in the runway's center required moving an estimated 100,000 cubic feet of earth. They moved it by hand, by truck, and by the captured Japanese dump cars, working in tropical heat that reached well above 90 degrees, under a sun that radiated back up from the graded earth. Officers worked alongside enlisted men. Kitchen staff was pulled from cooking duties. Every man who was not standing watch or holding the perimeter was on that runway. The field was formally named Henderson on August 12, the same day the first aircraft landed, a Navy Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant William Sampson, aide-de-camp to Rear Admiral John S. McCain Sr., commander of Air Forces South Pacific, making a reconnaissance visit. It was not a fighter. It was not going to hold the island. What the island needed were fighters, and they were 8 days away. On the afternoon of August 20, the escort carrier Long Island launched from approximately 200 miles to the southeast. 19 Wildcat fighters of Marine Fighting Squadron 223 under Major John L. Smith, 12 Dauntless dive bombers of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 232 under Major Richard C. Mangrum, 31 aircraft flying 200 miles with no alternate airfield to divert to, landing on a runway built by enemy hands, partially finished by infantry with borrowed tools, and repaired that morning after yet another Japanese bombing run. The first Dauntless came to a stop, and Mangrum climbed out. Vandergrift was there at the edge of the strip. He later wrote in his memoir, "I was close to tears, and I was not alone when the first SBD taxied up, and this handsome and dashing aviator jumped to the ground. 'Thank God you have come,' I told him." After 13 days of holding an island everyone back home seemed to have forgotten, it was an answer Vandergrift had not been sure was coming. This small group of aviators became the Cactus Air Force, named for the Allied code word for Guadalcanal. The next day, Major Smith earned his first credited aerial victory when he engaged Zeros of the Tainan Naval Air Group north of Savo Island. The same day, the Ichiki detachment made its night assault on the Tenaru River line and was annihilated. The pattern of the campaign was establishing itself. The Japanese attacked. They were stopped. The runway stayed open. On September 1, the first echelon of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore. 5 officers and 387 enlisted men under Lieutenant Commander Joseph Blundon, a Civil Engineer Corps officer who had already flown in by Catalina on August 20 to inspect the field and plan the work. These were the first Seabees to serve under enemy fire in the entire war. They dug their camp into a narrow coconut grove next to the runway and began the assessment that confirmed what Blundon had already seen. The drainage was inadequate. The surface was unstable. The crown was insufficient. Every rain left portions of the runway unusable. Japanese bombers had been hitting it nearly every day. Japanese 150mm artillery pieces on the hills above the coastal plain, known to the garrison as Pistol Pete, fired at irregular intervals day and night, with particular attention to the runway and the fuel storage areas. The Seabees understood what they were looking at. It was a construction problem, and construction problems had solutions. They began cutting a 12-inch crown down the centerline to shed rain to the sides. They excavated inadequate topsoil to a depth of 21 inches and replaced it with gravel, coral, and local clay compacted in layers. They dug lateral drainage channels along both edges of the runway. On September 25, 1942, they began laying Marston mat, the pierced steel planking developed for forward airstrip construction, each interlocking panel 2 feet wide and 10 feet long, laid by hand across the prepared surface. The work was done in heat that averaged over 90 degrees, in humidity that made the air feel like wet cloth, by men fighting malaria while working on rations that were never adequate. Aviation fuel was hand-pumped from 55-gallon drums, 1 drum at a time, rolled to the aircraft and pumped through a hose by hand. Ordnance was hand-loaded onto aircraft by men who had to stop, sprint to a slit trench, wait out a bombing run, and then come back and finish the job. There were no fuel trucks. There was no proper ordnance handling equipment. There was, in the early weeks, barely enough food. Everything was improvised by men who had built the real thing in peacetime and understood exactly which corner could be cut and which corner could not. They were not boys learning a trade. They were experienced professionals applying everything they knew to a set of conditions that no professional had previously encountered, and they adapted faster than anyone had a right to expect. Alongside the main runway, they built an entirely new strip from scratch. Fighter 1, known informally as the Cow Pasture, was a 4,600-foot grass runway, rolled from kunai grass on captured Japanese equipment, completed in early September. Fighter 2 at Kukum Point followed later that autumn. They also built a 225-foot bridge across the Lunga River, a 209-foot bridge across the Tenaru, tunnels into Pagoda Hill for the radar and radio installations, an aviation fuel tank farm, and 24 miles of roads connecting the airfield complex to the supply dumps and the perimeter defenses. They did all of this while taking incoming fire, while drilling as infantry, and while filling bomb craters in the main runway after every Japanese air raid. The work went on around the clock in rotating shifts. When the siren sounded, men dove into slit trenches cut beside the runway, lay flat while bombs fell within hundreds of feet, and climbed back out to continue working while the smoke was still rising. The Seabees developed a system for the one task that no other construction force had previously needed to master, repairing a functioning airfield under continuous bombardment. They preloaded trucks with gravel and coral before raids, so that when the all-clear sounded, the vehicles were already moving onto the surface. They used PVs, the long-handled tools of the logging trade, to pull the locking pins from damaged mast and mat sections so entire panels could be dragged aside and replaced in minutes. Lieutenant Commander Blundon told interviewers after the war that 100 Seabees could repair the damage of a 500-pound bomb crater on an airstrip in 40 minutes. The official Navy history of the bases built in World War II preserves one detail that captures the spirit of those months in a single image. At times, during the heaviest bombing periods, there were not enough shovels to supply all the men working the craters. Men filled bomb craters using their steel helmets, carrying dirt and coral one helmetful at a time into holes that had not existed 10 minutes before. Then came October 13. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita brought Battleship Division 3 into the waters off Guadalcanal on the night of October 13, 1942. His force consisted of the battleships Congo and Haruna, the cruiser Isuzu, and 9 destroyers. They arrived off Savo Sound at approximately 01:33 on October 14 and opened fire from roughly 17,500 yards. For 83 minutes, the 2 battleships fired 973 14-inch shells into the Lunga perimeter, most of them incendiary and high-explosive rounds designed to ignite aviation fuel and destroy aircraft on the ground. The bombardment destroyed 48 of the 90 aircraft of the Cactus Air Force. It burned nearly all of the aviation gasoline stockpile. It killed 41 men, including 6 pilots. It cratered the runway in dozens of places and undid weeks of drainage work in a single night. Survivors called it the bombardment for the rest of their lives, and they meant something specific by the definite article. There had been other shelling. This was something else entirely. Men who lived through it described the noise as a physical force that knocked them off their feet in the slit trenches and left them bleeding from the ears. By dawn on October 14, Japanese cruisers arrived and added 752 8-inch shells to what the battleships had already done. Within 48 hours, the airfield perimeter had absorbed 53 separate bombardment events. That morning, 14 B-17 flying fortresses took off through the shell craters on no more than 2,600 feet of available runway. The Seabees, the Marine pioneers, and every able-bodied man climbed out of the slit trenches and went back to work. Japanese bombers came twice more that day. The crews dove in, waited, climbed out, and kept going. The men had rehearsed the crater repair sequence so many times it had become automatic. Each man knew his role before the all-clear sounded. The truck drivers knew which section they were responsible for. The mat layers knew exactly how many panels they needed for a standard crater. Equipment operators had their machines positioned and running before the last bomb had hit the ground. It was not bravery in any theatrical sense. It was professional competence applied to an environment that had no right to produce professionals, and it worked because it had been drilled into the men until the work ran faster than the fear. Across the entire 4 months of the campaign, through 9 rounds of naval bombardment, through daily air raids, through ground assaults that brought Japanese infantry to within 150 feet of the runway's western edge, Henderson Field never went down for more than 4 hours. That figure is preserved in the official Navy history, and it is the single most remarkable fact of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The men who kept that runway open were not warriors in any conventional sense. They were tradesmen who had picked up rifles. On October 3, 1942, Seaman Second Class Lawrence Meyer, known to everyone as Bucky, was 25 years old and had been on Guadalcanal for 5 weeks. He was working near the airstrip when a Japanese strafing attack came in low along the runway. Meyer ran to a Marine machine gun position and manned the gun alone. He shot down a Zero. He was awarded the Silver Star, the first decorated Seabee of the entire war. 13 days later, on October 16, the same afternoon that Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer was flying his squadron from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal, a detail of Seabees, including Meyer, was on a fuel barge tied alongside the destroyer tender McFarland, transferring aviation gasoline into empty drums. 9 Japanese Aichi dive bombers of the 31st Air Group attacked the McFarland offshore. A bomb hit the barge. The explosion detonated among tens of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. Meyer, Chief Shipfitter Raleigh Jennings and 6 other Seabees on that barge were killed. Meyer had been on the island for 46 days. That afternoon, before the smoke had cleared over the McFarland, Bauer was arriving over Henderson with his fuel tanks nearly empty. He had spotted the Japanese formation on his approach, and rather than break off, he dove into the attacking Vals and shot down 4 of them before landing. His Medal of Honor citation would describe the act. Alone, fuel nearly exhausted, he fought his plane so brilliantly that 4 of the enemy were destroyed before he was forced down by lack of fuel. He was shot down himself on November 14 over the waters north of Guadalcanal. His body was never recovered. Lieutenant Commander Blundon's battalion arrived on September 1 with 392 men. By December 1, nearly half had been evacuated, mostly due to wounds, malaria, dysentery, and the kind of sustained exhaustion that had no clean medical name. The men who remained had been working and fighting simultaneously for 3 months in tropical heat, on reduced rations, under continuous attack, with no rotation and no foreseeable relief. By mid-October, the daily ration had been cut to 2 meals. For several weeks, the standard issue was 1 cup of rice and 1 portion of canned meat. Men lost 20, 30, 40 pounds. They worked anyway. What made the situation on the airfield particularly strange was the combination of extreme danger and extreme tedium that ran through most days. Mornings were often quiet except for Pistol Pete, which fired at unpredictable intervals so that every hour brought the possibility of a shell with no warning. Air raids came around noon most days, regular enough that the men began to structure their work around the expected arrival time, finishing one task and moving toward the slit trenches in the minutes before the Japanese formation was expected over the mountains to the north. The nights brought naval shelling on the worst nights, and the fear of naval shelling on the better ones. There was no leave, no rotation, no period of rest behind the line. The line was everywhere on Guadalcanal, and there was no place on the island that was more than a few miles from an enemy who wanted to be somewhere you were standing. The pilots paid alongside the engineers. Major John L. Smith shot down 19 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal and was awarded the Medal of Honor. Captain Marion Carl, the first Marine Corps ace of the war, flew until he was shot down and then walked out of the jungle on his own. Captain Joe Foss shot down 26 Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal, more than any other American aviator in the entire campaign, and survived to return home. The ground fighting twice came close to ending the runway's existence entirely. At the Battle of Edson's Ridge on September 12 and 13, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's raiders and paratroopers held a coral ridge, roughly a mile south of the runway, against a Japanese assault that killed 59 Americans and wounded 204. At the Battle for Henderson Field on October 23 through 26, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army launched a coordinated assault on 3 sides of the perimeter, with enough confidence in the outcome that his staff had already drafted the terms of an American surrender ceremony. His infantry was stopped by the wire, and by men like Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller, whose 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, held the line through a night that cost the battalion 30% casualties. The surrender ceremony was never held. The families of all these men received the same telegram that families had been receiving since December of 1941. It told them almost nothing. It did not tell them about the runway, about the craters, about the helmets full of coral in the dark. The men who built, and the men who flew, and the men who held the wire had all served the same purpose. The distinction between who had fired and who had built did not survive contact with what that island actually required. Henderson Field was not the only airfield built under fire in World War II, and the Seabees of the 6th Battalion were not the only engineers who faced conditions no training had fully prepared them for. On November 1, 1943, The 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville. 40,000 Japanese army troops and 20,000 Japanese naval personnel remained on the island, never defeated, only surrounded. Seabee battalions built the Torokina fighter strip and the Piva bomber runway, while Japanese artillery fired on the construction sites daily. The Seabees repaired the surface each time and kept building. At Munda Point on New Georgia, Seabees moved onto the captured Japanese strip on August 5, 1943, while Japanese artillery was still ranging the field and snipers were active in the surrounding jungle. The runway was operational for 48 based aircraft by August 13, 8 days from capture to operational status, under fire for every one of those 8 days. At Peleliu in September of 1944, the 1st Marine Division captured the Japanese airstrip on the 2nd day of the battle, while sustaining casualties that reached 70% in some units during the opening weeks. Seabees moved onto the airfield while Japanese defenders still held the coral escarpment directly overlooking the runway. Marine pilots flew napalm and bombing runs on caves no more than 1,000 yards from the runway threshold, taking off and landing in full view of Japanese observers in the cliffs above them. In Normandy, on June 6, 1944, United States Army aviation engineers had an emergency landing strip open at Poopville within hours of the D-Day landings, built while the battle was still audible within a mile. By VE Day, the engineering units of the 9th Air Force had built or rebuilt 241 airfields across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Germany. In Burma, on May 17, 1944, an airborne engineer aviation company landed by gliders on the Miet Kiina airstrip while it was still under Japanese fire and had the strip carrying transport aircraft within the same day. The pattern was the same across every theatre: engineers, airfields, fire, and the decision to keep working. Guadalcanal was declared secured on February 9, 1943. The Japanese had lost approximately 683 aircraft and nearly their entire stock of experienced carrier aviators across 6 months of fighting. The 17th Army had committed approximately 36,000 men to retaking the island. Roughly 10,652 survivors were evacuated by destroyer in the final days. The rest were dead, the majority from starvation and disease rather than combat, which was its own kind of verdict on how the campaign had gone. The significance of what had been held at Henderson Field was not lost on the men who planned the rest of the Pacific War. The campaign had demonstrated something that pre-war planners had theorized but never proven at scale, that a forward airfield, even an improvised one under sustained attack, could be the decisive instrument of an entire naval campaign. The Japanese fleet had not been able to suppress Henderson Field from the sea. Japanese air power operating at the end of a long supply line from Rabaul had not been able to destroy it from the air. Japanese infantry had not been able to take it from the ground. The Cactus Air Force, flying from a strip that was never more than a few hours from being unusable, had shot down enough aircraft and sunk enough ships to break the offensive capacity of the 17th Army and force the evacuation decision. The runway had been the center of gravity of the entire campaign, and it had held. Henderson Field did not close when the campaign ended. It became the primary base for the continuing advance up the Solomon Islands chain, expanded with additional runways, taxiways, and permanent facilities. The improvised techniques developed there became standard procedure at every subsequent island campaign. The 40-minute crater repair became a benchmark. The practice of pre-loading repair vehicles before raids became doctrine. By the end of World War II, the roughly 258,000 men who served in the naval construction battalions had built more than 400 advanced bases across 4 continents, including 111 major airstrips in the Pacific alone. They had constructed 441 piers, storage for 100 million gallons of fuel, and hospitals for 70,000 patients. The airfield on Tinian, Northfield, was built entirely by Seabee labour, and by 1945 was the largest airfield on Earth, with 4 parallel runways, each stretching 8,500 feet. From runway Able at Northfield, before sunrise on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off on the mission that ended the Pacific War. None of it, from the first runway at Henderson to the last runway at Tinian, was possible without the men who had built the first one under fire. Today, Henderson Field is still an operating airport. The runways of Honiara International Airport in the Solomon Islands occupy the same ground where Marines landed in 1942 and where the 6th Naval Construction Battalion built its first strips in September of that year. Tourist aircraft and cargo planes land there today on Earth. That was, in the autumn of 1942, the most contested ground in the Pacific. The American Guadalcanal Memorial on Skyline Ridge overlooks the coastal plain where the Marines landed. A Japanese memorial on Mount Austin marks the heights from which Pistol Pete fired down onto the runway for 4 months. The ground between them, covered now by the modern city of Honiara, was once the entire margin of the war. The National Seabee Memorial at Arlington, dedicated on Memorial Day of 1974 and sculpted by Felix de Weldon, shows a bronze Seabee reaching down to help a child to safety. 3 inscriptions mark the bronze. The first says simply, "Seabees can do." The second reads, "With compassion for others, we build, we fight for peace with freedom." The third, on the base of the central figure, reads, "With willing hearts and skillful hands, the difficult we do at once. The impossible takes a bit longer." War is usually remembered through its weapons and its commanders, through the ships and the aircraft, and the names inscribed in stone. The men who built the airfields tend not to make it into that kind of memory. They were not assigned to fire at the enemy. They were assigned to build something, and then to keep it standing while the enemy did everything possible to take it apart. That is a harder story to tell because it does not resolve in a single dramatic moment. It resolves in the accumulation of ordinary decisions made under impossible conditions. A helmet full of coral carried to a bomb crater, a section of steel planking dragged into position at 3 in the morning, a truck preloaded with gravel before a raid that had not yet begun. Bucky Meyer was 25 years old when he was killed on a fuel barge in the afternoon light of October 16, 1942. He did not die, firing a weapon at an enemy. He died transferring aviation gasoline so that the aircraft still on the runway behind him would be able to fly the next morning. Lofton Henderson was 39 years old when he flew his Vindicator into the Japanese carrier fleet and did not come back. Both men died in service of the same strip of ground. Both deaths had the same consequence. The runway stayed open, the aircraft kept flying, and the campaign survived long enough to turn the war. There is a particular kind of service that military history has always struggled to honor properly. The men who carried ammunition to the guns, who drove the supply trucks through the dark, who kept the engines running and the fuel flowing, occupy a different kind of memory than the men who fired the final round or led the final charge. They are harder to write about because their contribution accumulates rather than peaks. Their story has no single moment that stands in for everything else. What they did was continuous, and what made it matter was the refusal to stop doing it, regardless of what the enemy sent in to stop them. The men who built Henderson Field and kept it open were not extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and what made the difference was that they came to the Solomon Islands already knowing how to work, already knowing how to solve problems with the materials available, and already knowing, in the specific and practical way that tradesmen know things, that the difficult is merely a matter of time, and the impossible is merely a matter of a bit more time than that. They had their helmets, they had the coral, they had the job in front of them. The campaign at Guadalcanal is remembered today as the first offensive operation by American ground forces in the Pacific, the place where the momentum of the war shifted. Books are written about the naval battles and the air battles and the infantry actions. The Cactus Air Force has its histories and its monuments. The Marines of the 1st Division have their legacy written into the fabric of the Corps. What tends to get lost in all of that is the runway underneath all of it, the indispensable, unglamorous, continuously bombed and continuously repaired piece of earth that made every other act of valor possible. It is still there. Under the tarmac of Honiara International Airport, under the weight of the aircraft that land there every day, is the same ground that a group of 37-year-old tradesmen in uniform refused to let go dark in the autumn of 1942. They did it one helmetful of coral at a time, and they kept doing it until the war moved on and the runway no longer needed them. That is the story. It is not a story about glory, but it is a story about what wins wars.